business unit. I'm going to do a product manager thing for a little while and try that. Tim, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Tim Bollefer. I've gone all around in Microsoft for 10 years, bounced around between internal technology group, IT, and now I'm working in the security strategy team with guys like David LeBlanc out there.
So Tim and several other guys built our entry for OpenHack. What is OpenHack? OpenHack is a competition that eWeek magazine has had for 4 years now. We participated in OpenHacks 1, 2, and 4. And just as a kind of an interesting little side note, we've won every time. It is entirely possible for you to build a secure environment with Microsoft software. Now, don't let that come as a shock to any of you, because it can happen. I was involved in another competition earlier this year that MCP magazine ran, and again, we had an environment that I will still say was secure. No one was able to break into it from the network. The environment was compromised because we used what I'll call a layer 0 attack against the network. We convinced the security guard that it was time for her to go somewhere else for a little while, and then someone compromised the servers physically. So, what is the immutable law number what, right? Physical access to a machine and it's all over. What is it? Number 3, okay. So what we're going to show you today is what we did on OpenHack 4 in order to beat the competition. The competition being Oracle running on Linux, which was attacked within minutes of the system going live on the internet. Now, I hope that we'll actually be able to show you a few things. We didn't get the hardware up here that we were expecting. What is it? And I don't know. Most of it's kind of slideware, right? We have some demos that we might be able to run through. We'll just see what happens. So what are the components of something like this? This is what we built our OpenHack 4 entry with. Unlike the previous OpenHacks, which were more of a system-level target. Oh, and by the way, OpenHack 1 was probably the most interesting of all of these. It was just right after Windows 2000 came out, so no one had found any of the vulnerabilities yet, right, in Windows 2000 or IIS 5. So what did we do for OpenHack 1? Very important first step. Gave the administrator account a password. We added some IPSec filters that actually they weren't negotiating any security at all. They were just allowing traffic into destination port 80 and blocking everything else. And that was it. Right? That was all. But, people are smarter now. Some vulnerabilities have found. Some exploit code is running. But OpenHack itself has matured. And OpenHack 4 was all about trying to break an application, not break a system. So using these components, we built up an application whose specifications were set aside ahead of time by eWeek magazine. I want to call your attention to the bottom bullet down there. There were no firewalls at all in this. I think that's very important. Am I standing up here telling you that firewalls have outlived their usefulness and you should rip them out of your network? Not yet. But we're getting to that point of where the hosts and the applications themselves are starting to assume more and more responsibility for the security. I love it because that way it'll get the network back to what it does the best, right? Which is deliver bits. So the application was built on eWeek's own Excellence Awards website app. So it was something they've already got running and they were looking for, some free improvements to it, right? So user sets up an account. Whoops. How does that happen? All right, so let's start all over. Hi, I'm Steve. Oh, I pulled the wire out. Yeah, it's always a layer 1 issue, isn't it? Okay, so in this application, a user is going to set up an account. Okay, so what's the principal problem when users can self-provision? You don't know who anybody is, right? I guess that doesn't really matter here. You enter a product or service for judging. You submit a credit card number to pay an entry fee, because see, that's really all they care about, right, is getting that credit card number so they can zing your card for some money. And then you could read information about the award too. So the entrants were required to base their submission on this application. So we built it with the .NET framework using ASP.NET, ADO.NET, and some cryptography class libraries that are part of that. So the first thing we need to do, right, is somehow find out who this person is. IIS 6 gives you a number of different ways that you can use to authenticate users. Integrated windows, basic digest. You know, you've seen all this stuff before, right? You're Windows people. So eWeek wanted us to roll around. So we developed a forms-based front end to the application. So we post a username and password over SSL. Just, again, kind of general purpose things. You've probably seen these before. Use an encrypted cookie to maintain this logon session. Unauthenticated users can access the home page, right, the front one, and as well as a couple others. But if you were trying to directly get to a URL that was supposed to be secure, right, you would get redirected back to the login page. So it's pretty easy nowadays to do this with ASP.NET. We can, in a web.config file, create a system.web section that would apply to all pages in the application. Then in a subfolder underneath that, we can have another web.config file. It inherits all of the security settings from the parent level, and we can deny access to unauthorized users. And it's really quite easy. This is a 3-line system.web file, okay, in the or system.web section in the web.config file that directs all access to the login page. Then for pages that authorization or authentication is required before you can read them, it's a little bit more. So there's kind of the framework for how you would set that up. So it's not a lot of work anymore to just enforce that authentication happens before you get to a particular page. So we'd like to show you these, assuming that we get connectivity here.
For that part, you do have
Yeah, no, still nothing. All right.
Oh, actually, go to.
There you go.
All right, so basically what I'm going to show you right here is what we have in the web.config file that are implementing essentially the exact line you've seen there. So that, assuming the CD-ROM works.
It's slow.
Okay. Now there's two levels of these files. One of the files is in basically the public root of the web server itself. So if you look at the web config file here, so you're seeing in here the forms auth that he just mentioned. This is the authentication mode that he just showed in that one slide. So this essentially is allowing a user to come into the website and it's telling him, okay, I don't know who you are. Here's your login page. Please start your login process, or you can create an account, etc. Now there's a second web config that is actually put in the more secure portion of the website. And we've, of course, labeled that secure to make it real obvious for ourselves, I guess. And again, we have the web config.
Just choose send to notepad.
Thank you. All this is doing here is saying that if a user hasn't authenticated to the application, they're denied. That's essentially it for the web.config files we use for OpenHack. You gonna keep you back there?
Yeah.
Where is your slide?
Third one. There we go. Isn't there a hotkey to go straight to the power or to the presentation mode? I can never remember this stuff. So to create a new user, We're not using Active Directory here. We're just using our own account store. We want to capture their username and whatever password that they want to associate with that, and then store that in our sort of our own application directory. We'll encrypt that password with triple des, store that in the database. If someone is then coming back to log into their existing account, we'll encrypt the password with triple des and then fire that across the network, right? So that now we've got not real passwords going across, just, again, basic stuff, right? Compare it to the encrypted password stored in the database, and if it's in, then we send a cookie to the user, and we do this all over SSL. What becomes more and more important and has taken a long time for people to learn, but they're starting to learn this now, is that you can't just blindly accept what someone's going to give you in an application. You want to validate that, make sure that that's expected for whatever you're asking the user to supply. So by doing some input validation, we can guard against a number of attack classes here, right? Buffer overruns, cross-site scripting, insertion of other kinds of malicious code. You want to plan for the worst and build in validation in multiple layers. You need to assume that one or more tiers here could become compromised. So in the application that we submitted for OpenHack, we're performing 4 different checks against the input. We're looking at all of just everything that someone might enter into a field on a form, so we're checking that first. Any URLs that will have any kind of query string in them at all, we're checking that. Access to the database itself is not done over dynamic queries, but we use only parameterized stored procedures for that, and someone had already talked about that in a session earlier today. And then the last thing we do is HTML encode all of the data sent back to people. So we're not sending them back scripts that run. It's just static text. So the first check, we call 2 different ASP.NET classes to validate input fields. Regular expression validator and required field validator. This will allow us to limit input characters to what we needed here, which is a space, apostrophe, comma, period, letters, and numbers. So other characters are blocked, things that are commonly used to try to perform SQL injection attacks, for example. The second check is parsing that URL string. So we call another .NET method system.text.regularExpressions.regex. And the goal here is that for these particular URLs we are validating, we want numbers only. So there's the snippet of code that gets executed for that purpose. Whoops. The third check, using stored procedures for access to the database. Doing this limits the application's interaction, right? You can't just submit dynamic queries. You can only do these particular kinds of things. And we strongly type the parameters too, so that if someone's trying to pass something to the parameter, to the engine that we don't want, right, we're just going to discard it if it's not the right type. Finally, the fourth check is we send HTML only back to the user. I think this is a really important new thing that we can do with ASP.NET. I don't know a lot about app dev, but I don't know was this even possible before, easily? Not easily, no. Now it's very easy. It's sumlabel.text equals server.html encode and username, and bam, you're done. It's just a single call. And we don't have, do we have connectivity? Is it finally working?
I'm not getting it.
No. Okay, so none of the rest of them are going to work. And we don't have a video switcher up here, unfortunately. They got us in the wrong room. So, hey, I have an idea. Let's try something. Watch us blow up here. Right there.
Thank you. Okay.
And let's.
Am I above its resolution?
You have to hit function F5 to turn it. It's not even on.
Come on.
Yes. All right.
Great. I know you guys in the back are probably cursing this screen right now. Oh.
Especially since it cut off up here too. Okay, let's.
Okay, you all go ahead with it. We'll come back to that later.
What's that? It was just on. Yeah, all right.
Oh, man. My big hourglass is up.
Okay, okay, we're on.
All right. Now my box is absolutely crawling, and I don't know why. All right, so what I'm trying to do here is get to a stage where I can actually get into the...
Unminimize that and slide it over because the left edge of it's cutting off.
That's a note to my management when I get a new laptop when I get home. The regular expression validator and the required field validator, if I can get my laptop to actually give me a mouse back, is going to show up in a lot of those ASP files that are in the default directory. For example, the login, where you're looking for entering your credentials for creating a new account. And this is just locked.
Did it freeze?
It froze.
Okay, just keep talking.
So, what I would show you is that there's on the input field, you're coming across the expressions, and before the actual engine within the website is parsing them and allowing that input to go through, it's validating them before it actually takes the input. So when you use, for example, regular expression validator or required field validator, those are, as the user is entering them, actually making sure that that data is accurate, that it is acceptable to the application. So you're not getting, it mitigates that risk of cross-site. You don't have somebody that can slip something in there because it's not an allowed character. It won't even take it. The other one we have here is that the stored procedures on the SQL databases are all locked down specifically so that the application of the web front end is talking about specific stored procedures on the database. The database is not trusting that what it's getting from the web server is good information, so it is also providing validation to the input it's receiving to the database. And finally, when users are getting output back, we make sure that that output is run through HTML encode. It's hammered. So that all they get back is harmless text. So a cross-site scripting attack, for example, is, again, mitigated. HTML encode makes sure it's just HTML data that's going back to the client.
So the next thing you need to now concern yourself with is how do we store these secrets in a secure way, right? We've got passwords that we're storing here. The database connection and login string, right? What do most people do when IIS wants to talk to SQL? SQL Server is set up for SQL authentication, right? And they're passing in an SA account with no password, okay? Well, all right, so they're going to be stronger and they're going to put a good password on the SA account, but then IIS reads a text file to see the connection string and hands it in the clear over the wire to the SQL Server, right? Well, for protecting these two kinds of information, we're going to take a couple different approaches. The web application needs to authenticate to the database. So rather than taking the normal approach of storing this ID and password in some text file somewhere, we're going to use this novel thing called Windows authentication. Huh? What's that? Well, in our connect string now, we only need to have the server name and the database name. We're not actually providing any password, right? Because the IIS computer and the SQL computer are members of the domain. Or we're using local accounts that might be have the same name. So we're storing this in the code behind file, which is the core application logic, right? Not in any user interface definition file. It's still not enough, though, because if an attacker got on the IIS computer, you could read the file. So what are we doing? We're encrypting this using a call to something else in ASP.NET, or in the data protection API. Two calls, crypt protect data and crypt unprotect data, allows us to store secrets without actually having to manage any of the keys. we store the string in the registry, the encrypted string, but then we ACL these particular registry keys, right, so that only administrators can read them and the ASP network or process. But for storing user information, that credit card data, okay, DT API is a little less useful here. Remember that we said that we don't have to manage keys. Well, it's because they're kind of managed for us. The keys are based on local machine information. So imagine if we had 87 web servers in a web server farm somewhere, we'd have to have 87 different keys that we were going to manage with DT API on the SQL Server side, and that gets cumbersome, right? So instead, we're going to generate an encryption key and an initialization vector. We'll systematically encrypt each password and credit card number that we're going to store in the database using this key that we got generated. Then we encrypt the key and the initialization vector with DP API, ACL that in the registry on the web server. So now we have one key that all of the web servers in the farm can use. And we use kind of the same method we did before for protecting the key itself. So do you have the code for storing secrets on this CD in my laptop? It's over there.
We got the machine that's running that piece working. So
can I terminal server to it?
yeah, go to .10, 10.13.0.10.
Yes. All right.
Yeah, there's some kind of.
So there's something wrong with 0.2.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. Okay, I'll log in. Okay, now the code that's actually doing the encryption of this, there's two separate areas that we encrypted and stored in the registry. One was the actual DSN. So, like he was describing, a lot of people put the classic, database connection strings into their Java applet or something within the website that can then be served and sifted, and of course yield the plain text password to an attacker. So what we did is we used a we used the API calls to go and build an app. Tell you what, I'm going to do this because I already have it prepped over. I wish we had that switch box. This is driving me crazy. Come on.
There you go.
Yes. Okay, so we have a tool that the Eric Olson and his team, who actually built the web app for us for the contest, wrote, called setPassword. And what setPassword does is it takes in a full DSN string like you would put in your web app to access the database. Same string. And it actually encrypts it and stores it in a key, which they aptly called OpenHack, which is under your, in our case, we put it under Microsoft software under the local machine store. So the session key and the SQL connection string are actually stored in an encrypted fashion on the server itself. So if you compromise the server, you're getting a big pile of goo in terms of how you would connect to the remote server behind in the private section of the network. On top of that, we ACLed the key so that only the ASP.NET service and, of course, I used the wrong registry after. Only the ASP.NET service and administrators could actually access and read that key. So you couldn't get in from an anonymous point of view or take a user credential. It had to be one of those two services to actually interact with the key. That's pretty much it for the storing sequence.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah, question somewhere? Okay, the question was, is the key being used as a landman hash and just the encrypted key on the other side being processed, or are we decrypting it on the other end?
Actually, in this case, we've disabled all the landman hash, between.
Well, but is it functioning similar to that?
I'm sorry. It's actually storing that full connection string, so I wouldn't call it a LMHash. It's actually that string is encrypted, and then as the application calls that, so it can make the connection to the database, it's actually, as far as the application is concerned, it's clear text because it has the key to decrypt it. Only within certain channels, but yeah, you would be able to, if you compromise the web app, the web server itself, the failure mode at that point is, okay, the SQL server no longer trusts it. So that's the defense in depth. We figured that every piece of the application could be compromised at one point or another. Yeah, if somebody were able to, for example, steal the actual code of the site, it wouldn't get them anything. It would just get them, started. No, that's authenticating using, in this case, NTLM v2.
Right, it's NTLM authentication. What we're storing encrypted is the connection string that the app uses to connect to the database, right? What is the database name and what is the machine name? And then we're encrypting the key that's used to encrypt the connection string. So like Tim said, what this does is it eliminates the condition under which an attacker can just steal the code and log into the database directly because there's nothing useful, there's nothing in the code, right? But if you were admin on the box, on the web server, then yeah, I mean,
you could do everything the web server could do, which is decrypt the connection string. And at that point, there's additional restrictions we built in case of that.
Right, we haven't gotten that far down yet. So what did we then do on IIS-5? Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that first bullet point. I hope you all understand the value of that one. Then just a couple other things, right? We moved the default website to another volume. Actually, I've got slides on most of these, so I'm just going to kind of zoom through them here. So we took the default website out of System Drive INET Pub and stuck it on a different volume in a different folder name. So now, an attacker needs to have some knowledge of the directory tree. You can't just count on using these double dot slash attacks anymore and trying to get to the root of C. Next thing we did was run JISLockDown. We had a session earlier today where people were talking about that, and the question was asked, how many of you have seen JISLockDown? I ask again, how many of you have seen this? All right. So one of the things that you should do, for those of you who didn't raise your hands, is make a little note, and when you're sitting in the hotel tonight, hoping that no one is attacking your computer on the network, go check this thing out. It's really cool. It does all of the stuff that, well, frankly, should have been done out of the box, but nevertheless, it's very easy to do them all now with just a couple clicks of a button on this thing. We will modify one of the lockdown templates for our specific purposes, and then there's the URL where you can go find it. Next, we install the .NET framework on the web server. And this is one of those things that you can't do with just a single click, right? You need to get the redistributable, and then you need to get Service Pack 2. You then need to get the latest hotfix, which strengthens some credentials, and then finally MDAC, which is a part of the application's requirements. Next thing we do is remove some extension mappings. The only thing we need is ASPX. So we just take all the rest of them straight out of the web server. And not only that, but we actually remap these unused extensions to the 401.dll page, which is included with JISLockDown. So if someone's trying to call up some other extension, they're going to get an error in their web browser. Whoops. Come on. There we go. Next is account privileges and permissions. There's a lot of debate that goes on about what service account should something run under, right? Is it a local account? Is it a domain user account? Whatever. We use a default local ASP.NET service account that gets created during the framework's installation. This account is placed in the local users group. The account also receives the following permissions. On the temporary ASP.NET folder, it has full access On the temp folder, it has full access and read access to the framework installation folder. JISLockDown creates a local group called Web Application Group. So we add the ASP.NET Service account to this application group. The cool thing about this group is that it can't run executables. And then we update this group's permissions so that we can run the C# compiler and the resource converter. That was another thing required by the application. Then another component of the lockdown tool is URLScan. A couple people have been talking about this already. It's part of JISLockDown. This, more than anything else, I think this is the kind of stuff that is just a no-brainer anymore, right? URLScan absorbs the URL before it even passes it on to inetinfo. And when we put URLScan on Microsoft.com web servers, we noticed a performance improvement of over 25%. Because URLScan is just throwing away the junk, right? So inetinfo is only seeing the good stuff. It's incredible what this thing can do. We modify the INI file so that we allow only the application's extensions, and then we specifically want to block long requests. I was chatting with somebody else earlier today about this. One thing that the INI files do by default is something a little different than what you traditionally do with a firewall rule set. What does a firewall rule set do? It blocks everything and then except, right? You list the kinds of things that you want to allow. URLScan kind of takes a different approach, right? By default, it wants to run a deny extension section. And so you explicitly list all of the extensions that you want to deny, meaning you're going to allow everything else. Well, I was thinking that maybe we need to rewrite this thing, right? So that we simply say we allow the following extensions and deny everything else. It turns out that URLScan processes deny extensions first. So the gentleman I was talking with said he had a really long URLScan, and by that I'm presuming like what, maybe 16 or 17K. Most of it is deny extensions, and because it processes that first and really, really fast, you can just throw off the junk right away before it even comes in. Modify some ACLs on the folder and the log. This is another very important thing. So you can see the modifications that we made right here. How many of you, when you're working with IIS and you're hardening it, remember to do the log files? I'm just curious. A couple of you. Okay, that is something that would routinely slip my mind. I can guarantee you that if I'm not sitting down with a checklist in front of my face. So that's why we're giving you this. Here is your checklist, right? Can we show this?
Yeah, I got this one over here.
All right.
In fact, this one works. So. Bad cable.
Really?
Yep. I put my back to back in. We're good.
Bad cable.
Well.
Roberta, are you here? What was the #1 problem that we had when we were first going to go live with the MCP thing? It's a bad cable?
Okay. Now, what I've got here is I have actually brought up the Internet Information Services Lockdown Wizard on a simulated OH web server that we built. This is the app that we actually submitted. So this is the IIS Lockdown Wizard. Going through it, I'm of course going to agree to this because I don't read it and then I agree anyway. And we configured this as a static web server. So going down through the static web server, it comes in next. Here's a URLScan. It says, do you want to install this? And of course, yes, we do. I'll say next here. And it's going to go through the box and actually configure the extensions, disable unnecessary services, and do some remapping for us.
And built into the template, you see all of the things there it just said that I am going to do for you when you hit next, right? Well, that's already defined in the static web server template. You can manually run through JISLockDown and pick all those individual things if you want. But the templates just make it easier to reproduce this accurately. Oh, and one other thing about JISLockDown, it applies fairly quickly to a web server. How many of you have tried to undo JISLockDown, if you've tried to do it at all? Okay. Is it a pleasant experience? Now, it takes a long time, and I don't understand why, but for some reason, undoing JISLockDown is a slow, arduous, very disk-intensive process. So make sure that you've got JISLockDown configured exactly the way you want to before you hit that run button. Yeah. Modified the template. Let me back up here. Yeah, I know. Are you done?
You want it back? Well,
No, I just want to.
I'll take you over here for a minute.
Yeah. Two modifications. We needed to add the application's own extension, the ASPX, to the baseline static web server file. Who asked the question? And then the other thing is that we specifically told URLScan we want to trash really long URLs. Right?
Okay. So, what you're seeing here, if we get off the blue. All right. What you're seeing here is just the results of the application of that static web template. You can view the report if you'd like, which will provide some more detail on what it did. Tells you what it did, removed the script. When he's talking about actually going back and undoing something, if you overlock down your server, this is a good place to start. So I'm going to go ahead and say next and finish this. And hopefully the website's still alive and working. So here's a different server that I'm using VMware, for those of you who know what it is. This is what the actual website looked like. This is now post-lockdown. And we're going to go to the login page.
Anybody care to guess what the password was there?
All right, well, I overlocked it. So I'll have to go back and look and see what I broke there. Essentially, that's JISLockDown flying through and doing that piece of it. What was the other stuff we had? The accounts and the extension remapping, which I think is probably what I just broke there. URLScan is going to put it. So we're talking about the logs. Here's our URLScan.log, which is underneath OpenHack, which is the root of our application directory.
How did that thing get 860K already?
This is actually the backup image of what we actually submitted. So this log actually has real files and real data in it from the actual application submitted. So the URLScan logs are stored right underneath the root of the directory under logs. And if we check out the actual application ACLs here, golly, I'm going crazy that way. Come on. So when you're talking about actually locking down permissions and access to these files, it's just as simple as going and running your NTFS permissions to actually lock them down. So we would remove the everyone off. It would just be, don't want to do that. Demo hell day. Well, now nobody can do anything with it, but you're getting the idea. Basically, you want to restrict it down to minimum access. The
Which you just did.
Yes, yes, I did. All right, 10 years at Microsoft, I can't use the GUI. So
That's good.
that's pretty much it. Glad I had a copy up before I blew it up. There we go.
So there's 87, I use that number all the time, I don't know why. 45 guides you can purchase, download, whatever, that tell you how to lock down Windows 2000 server. Windows Server 2003, Windows 2000, whatever. You know, you've probably all got your favorites, and that's cool. What we're going to show you here today are the few things that we did to the operating system to prep it for OpenHack. And it actually wasn't a whole lot, okay? again, update those service packs and security hotfixes first. Yeah, I think it probably doesn't need saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Don't plug the thing into the network until you get service pack, the service pack on there at least. Disable unused OS services, and then there's a few registry-based tightenings that we do. And I think that, more than some of the other stuff, there's some really cool things you can do in the registry that many guides just fail to include. The baseline template disabled all of these services for the machines that we built for OpenHack. Then we had to re-enable a few things for some of the applications. For example, for SQL Server, we went ahead and disabled the SQL Server agent, but we brought Landman Server down to manual. Disabled LM hosts on terminal server, had no need for any of that. Disabled Landman Server on the web server. We had to re-enable a few things on the VPN management server. Of course, we need to make a remote access VPN connection to that thing. And unfortunately, something's going to kill you when you're trying to devise your own lockdown list is this beautiful service called Remote Registry. Things need remote registry that you don't expect, and VPN is one of them. Finally, then, some registry tweaks. A couple of these you've probably seen. NoLMHash. This prevents the OS from storing LM hashes of the passwords in the SAM. So there's the location in the registry for that. Note that this changes in XP and Server 2003 from a key to a value. NoDefaultExempt for IPSec. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, what we did with IPSec. One of the things that our IPSec does is we can use Kerberos as the authenticator between machines that want to establish a security association. Well, if you're going to do that, you need to allow that Kerberos traffic to get between the two machines, right? So by default, we exempt Kerberos from any IPSec rule processing. Turns out that that creates a vulnerability in some circumstances that you could maybe source an attack from port 88 into the destination machine, and it's just going to get right past, right? So we set NoDefaultExempt to 2. So that means that Kerberos and RSVP traffic now are not exempted from the rules. But what's the side effect of that? You can't use Kerberos as the authentication mechanism between the two peers. You need to use either a pre-shared key, which is bad, right? Or a certificate, which is good. The thing about pre-shared keys is they're stored in the clear in the registry, and shared secrets don't remain secret for very long, do they? We disable IP source routing in the registry. So you just cannot get a packet out of the box that has a route specified in the IP header, right? There's no reason today to do that. You had to 15 years ago when routers sucked, but now they're really good. So this is always, these days, a sign of an attack. And then finally, we turn on this one. Quick poll. How many of you know about SynAttackProtect in the registry? OK, good. More than I was expecting. But essentially, this limits the amount of resources that the stack itself will use to process incoming SYN requests so that you can't SYN flood the thing.
OK.
We'll show you where these things live in the registry.
All right. So the 4 key ones he hit on were the SynAttackProtect, the disable IP source routing, the NoDefaultExempt, and the NoLMHash. On the NoLMHash, you're basically going to be looking in your HKLM system current control set, control LSA, and I got ahead of myself and went down. So we got the control, and down here's LSA. And what you're doing is you're going to create this registry key, just as you would any other ones. If I could type. So now at this point, my operating system is no longer going to store any user passwords in the LMHash format. So when a user goes to change his password, this won't become a vulnerability for a password cracking tool like pwdump, so that you can feed it into Loftcrack. You'll no longer be storing the LMHash version of the password. In terms of IPSec, there's the NoDefaultExempt. That's taking care of the Kerberos. We do it the same way. I wanted to touch on the services piece that we actually glossed over a little bit, and I wanted to make sure we got into that. And for the IPSec, you would enter the same keys. Note that if you're running Windows XP versions or you're running Windows 2000, the safest way to do it is to put a key and a value. If you're doing this via script, which is a very common way of doing it, that way, regardless of the type of operating system you're running on, you will be configured so that the IPSec is running the way you want it to, and you're not thinking it's running one way and it's actually not. I brought up here the tools that we use to generate the services on the box and manage the allowed services to be running. So what we're doing here is limiting the footprint of the services that are listening. Once we go in and actually disable some of these services, take Alerter for example, we had no use for it. So we would actually go about stopping it, setting it to disabled. So I'll stop the service. I'll set it to disabled. And I go about doing this for all the services that I don't want running on the system. The issue you run into is this doesn't scale very well. So we're going to go back and use a tool that you might not have seen before, which is security configuration analysis.
Slide that window over a little bit.
Oh, I'm too far off.
There you go.
Sorry about that. Security configuration analysis will let us take a baseline and create a new database of options that are set on a specific box. So
who here has used this before? Okay, good number here.
Okay. I think it's just open database, isn't it? All right. All right. Might just skip off of this. I'm having fun with these boxes today.
Yeah, they're not acting very good, are you?
Man, demo hell day. What you would do with the tool is you would just take a snapshot of the box. It would do a baseline, and then you can take that same baseline and apply it to the systems that are in your installation. So in our case, we set up a baseline with all Alerter turned off, Messenger turned off, and various other services disabled, created a template called baseline, and then applied that to all the separate systems.
It provides you with a way to roll back to. If you lock down something too hard, you can easily go back to a previous setting. Note that that's not an automatic thing. So what you really need to do in order to take advantage of this rollback feature is create a template of the computer now, right? Save that, and then apply your changes. And if you didn't like what those changes did, then you go back to the previous template. The other thing that tool can do for you is the analysis side. You can just pick a computer, right? Run the template against the computer. It doesn't actually make changes, but it will highlight the differences between what's in the file and the way the computer is configured right now. I like polls. I love asking questions because I want to see how many people are using things. Who here has used the IPSec engine in Windows 2000 as just a basic packet filter for blocking and allowing things? Okay. I like this a lot. So much so that I wrote an article and put it on TechNet about how to do that. Remember what I said at the beginning. We didn't have any firewalls here. So something you can do in a situation where you might not have firewalls or where you want to have more control over what's coming into the individual box because maybe the firewall policy is too loose, is you can use this engine as a really great packet filter to just allow or block traffic that matches specifications, you know, what's the port number and where's it coming from, that kind of thing. So we do that a little bit here, but we take it even farther, and we actually establish security associations between the computers here. Why would you want to do something like that? Well, you know, you've all seen and probably even built various kinds of man-in-the-middle attacks, right, that involve address spoofing and pretending to be somebody that you aren't. The nice thing about IPSec, and especially if you use certificates as the authenticator, because then you don't have to worry about having the machines in the same forest or whatever, you eliminate the conditions under which those kinds of man-in-the-middle attacks can happen. These two machines have got to have a certificate in common. I don't mean the same certificate. They've got to have, the certificates need to have been signed by the same certificate authority, because you pick the certificate authority in the UI, not the certificate itself. The engine selects the certificate. And because PKI trust is all within, you know, the certificate issuance process, the assumption is that if machine A and machine B both have computer certs that have been generated by the same CA, or been signed by the same CA, then, hey, these two machines should be able to trust each other. So we set up a security association between the two, and now every packet that leaves, especially if you just use IPSec AH, right? Every packet that comes out of that computer is signed. So if there's some other computer that says, hey, the only thing I'm going to accept is IPSec traffic, then the only thing it's going to accept is that signed traffic, right? Something that we can't do with Windows 2000 is enforce domain membership. How many of you think that might be a great idea? Would you love it if every machine that plugged into the LAN on your network belonged to the domain? None of you? Some of you. Okay, raise your hand really high if you think that's a good idea. Raise your hand really high if you think it's a lousy idea. Okay, this is interesting. Why do you think it's a bad idea? I'm really curious. Why do you not want every machine to be a member of your corporate domain?
Because you have different functions depending on the domain. You may control the compromise if you've got somebody that has access to everything that they might not need.
Okay, so I'm talking corporate clients, right? Not servers.
Well, even for compliance, you've got
Different areas, right, in the group.
that you segregate depending on.
Okay, so you segregate to 87 domains,
Right.
right? But you want them to be a member of some domain.
Well, you want to have some sort of trust of some,
Right.
not necessarily of all of them.
Right, well, that's why we partition with domains, right, and maybe even forests if you're really going to get paranoid about things. But something that I think is really important is that you establish it as a standard that all client computers in your organization belong to some domain somewhere, right? Because that way you can start to enforce certain kinds of policies. I'm not talking here about preventing people from changing their backgrounds, right? If they want a purple background, let them have a fucking purple background. It doesn't matter. But you may not want people to change their password policy on their local machine, right? You might want to enforce some kind of a strong password even on the local administrator account. You can do these kinds of things if you enforce domain membership, but we can't do it, right? You could take a computer that doesn't belong to the domain, plug it into a LAN socket, try to access a network resource, and what happens? You get a little dialog box that asks you for your credentials, right? What do we do in XP? We give you this thing called a keyring that makes it even easier, so it memorizes them. Well, what if you established IPSec AH everywhere in your network? And you said, if all of your servers had an IPSec AH policy, I'm not going to let you talk to me unless you can establish IPSec AH. Furthermore, the only way we're going to establish IPSec AH is with Kerberos, right? So now, you're not a domain member. That means you don't get the IPSec group policy. You try to talk to this server. The server says, got to set up IPSec. You can't set up IPSec because you're not a domain member, right? Very, very nice. It works very, very well. You have to join the domain in order to talk to the servers. So you can put all the traffic on the LAN you want, but if every machine in your organization required IPSec AH and this traffic injector wasn't doing that, all that garbage is going to get ignored. I think this is pretty cool. We're starting to deploy this inside Microsoft, and I'm seeing customers do it now too. I think it's a really neat thing. In the environment here, we're taking that even farther, and not only are we using AH between certain things, but we're also using ESP, which is what everybody thinks about when they hear IPSec, right? You think about encryption. You forget about this cool thing you can do with AH. Before you can establish your IPSec policy, though, you need to figure out what is the traffic. What's going on? What are my requirements between all of these things? So what do we have going on here? We have the web server talking to SQL Server. We have the RAS server talking to the management net over L2TP, but then that's carried inside IPSec, right? So that's kind of already happening. The management server wants to talk to clients for terminal services and file sharing, right? These are the managers. The management server wants to talk to everything in the environment over the private network, and then all the servers need to talk to the management server for file shares. And we'll explain why we are doing some file sharing in a bit. It was a requirement of the contest. So we use, in this case, digital certificates for authenticator between all of the computers. Because our machines don't belong to the domain here, so we can't use Kerberos for that purpose. Another thing to remember, once you establish or once you enroll all of the computers for computer certificates, you don't need the CA anymore. So take it away, right? Stick it in a vault somewhere or something if you feel like you might need to regenerate certificates later. But you don't need that thing online. Between all computers, we are signing the traffic. So, at least IPSec AH everywhere. And I talked about one reason why you might want to do that. Abstractly, we're talking about machine-to-machine authentication here. You know who your users are, right? Let's start building a system where the computers themselves know each other. Then this also protects integrity. There is some traffic that we are encrypting, right? Anything to or from the management server, we want to encrypt. We want to protect the confidentiality of that information. What's that? Oh, okay, sorry, that's a typo. Yeah, that should be 3 des. I got ahead of myself in reading my notes. Hey, man, this was originally not scheduled right. I found out 3 days ago we were going to have to do this session, so it was kind of like a last-minute thing. But I'm glad we were able to talk to you about it, because I think it's pretty cool. So what did we do to start building the policies? Well, initially we said, we're going to take the firewall rule set, right? Nothing in. Block it all. And then start to loosen stuff a little bit at a time. So between the web server and the SQL server, we're using our filter action called authenticate and sign. So this is IPSec AH. Between the management server and everything in both directions, right, we're using our policy called authenticate, sign, and encrypt. So here we've got ESP and AH. Now I want to say something here. You cannot use ESP only for this purpose. If you use ESP only, you get authenticate and encrypt and a little bit of signing, but not a lot of signing. AH creates its integrity checksum over the whole packet, including the header, the IP header. ESP doesn't do that. The integrity checksum for ESP starts at the next protocol and goes to the end of the packet. The IP header is not authenticated in ESP only. So I'm a big fan of authenticated communication, so I would actually never in production build an environment that ESP only. If I'm concerned about confidentiality, I'll use ESP plus AH because I want to get that integrity across the entire packet. But then access from the internet to the web servers, this is where we use one of these packet filters, right? We're going to permit traffic to destination port 80, but just silently drop everything else. It kind of helps if you make a picture when you're going to do all of this. So that just following the picture here will help you when you're writing your own policies. That this way you won't eliminate something that might be very important. You want to show the UI?
Yeah. Okay, so when you're looking at the IPSec UI, There's a couple things to keep in mind. Now, he mentioned that you could use a pre-shared key to help negotiate between two systems so they could establish an IPSec session. Problem with that is, as we discussed, we're assuming that we're going to lose like the web server as part of the competition, and the main goal was to get at the database. So a pre-shared key was kind of out of the question. Once you've gained administrative rights to the web server, which actually never happened, but we assumed it would, you would be able to figure out what that pre-shared key was and then be able to negotiate an IPSec session all the way to the back-end server. So that wasn't doable. So what we have here is the IPSec policy for in this case, the VPN server. And in order to be able to use the certificate, and the advantage to that is without having a certificate generated by the CA and with the private key on your box, you can't communicate. You don't have any means of authenticating with the remote system. So under the Trusted Certificate Store on the local machine, we added the public key for the OpenHack competition, basically, so that it knows, it can figure out if somebody's really been authenticated, or their certificate really came from that certificate authority. And on the other side, under the personal certificates, we created a certificate for each system. In this case, we just named it after the box, which also had the private key. And this allows him to begin that negotiation to establish the IPSec encrypted tunnels. Now, to take advantage of that, now that the certificates are imported and set up, we created a policy on the system. So in this case, it's got a default response just as you would if you just created a generic blank policy. If we add a rule to it, it's going to say, man, we need two screens. You saw in the picture that we had the relationship set up between the systems. What port, what IP address was then put into these rules. Every system then had a set of rules that mirrored the other box it was communicating with. What you wound up with then was a set of rules, and I'm going to bring this up here, that authenticate using a specific method. In this case, we're going to say use a certificate from our certificate authority. And I'm going to create another filter. This is basically a filter that just is saying IP traffic-wise, what is it? What kind of traffic am I looking for? So I'm going to say add a filter. I'm going to say from a specific IP address. In our case, we had a really small implementation. So this system's IP address is, where are my notes here? Darn it. This says from the private network link on the VPN server to the private network, or the terminal server. And if you saw the drawing again, this would make sense, but unfortunately we don't have that up. I want to allow the VPN server to be managed on port 3389. This basically is going to allow that management server to TS to this box. On the management server, there's a rule that actually mirrors this, that then allows it to connect to the VPN server to manage it and modify the settings on it. That's basically how the rule works. In terms of setting up the policies, in terms of what it's doing as part of the rule, we're talking about the hashing, we're talking about the encryption. I'll create an action called encrypt and sign. I'm going to tell it to negotiate security. Now, this is where we also set up the default deny rule. So you create a separate rule that just says just block. But here we're going to say negotiate security. Say do not communicate with a computer that doesn't support IPSec. I'm going to do a custom setting just so you can see the options you have. So data integrity, we use SHA-1. And for the encryption, there's triple des there. And this is the error he pointed out a moment ago.
A couple things to remember. The defaults in Windows 2000 are MD5 and single des. Here in XP and Server 2003, the defaults are SHA-1 and triple des. So this actually blew up in my face in a demo one time, and I didn't realize we had changed the defaults.
So now I've created that encrypted sign. I'm saying that's the action I want taken for any traffic that matches that IP and port pair. And now I have a rule that handles that IP filter list. And we went through and did that for all the ports that were being used between the systems, and then we propagated those rules across the systems. So in the case that you lost the web server, the SQL server wouldn't talk to the web server because it didn't have a set of rules that would allow that traffic to come in. So it was protected on both sides.
Yeah, I took it out. One of the requirements of the contest was to have some kind of remote management ability. And specifically is that this remote management ability needs to provide a way to update the content during the contest. So our solution for this is to configure a system in which administrators over an L2TP IPSec VPN connect to a central terminal server, and then from there they would branch out to other machines, nesting terminal server. Also some restricted file shares for uploading and downloading the content. So to begin with is this remote access VPN. Just a review, right? L2TP is the tunnel. It has no security. You need to put that inside something to secure it. So we're sticking that inside IPSec. On the wire, outside of the Windows boxes, this is IPSec traffic. You don't see L2TP on the wire, right? It's L2TP once it comes into the box and goes through the stack and goes through IPSec and gets re-injected back into the stack, then it's L2TP. So this is kind of an interesting thing, right? Let's say you had a firewall in front of this. That firewall would have to allow IPSec. But then let's say inside RRAS you wanted to write packet filters. The RRAS packet filters are not IPSec. It's L2TP. Because again, the traffic comes in as IPSec, goes through the IPSec engine, down to the IP stack, gets decrypted, re-injected into the stack, it's L2TP. And then it comes back down into RRAS finally. So what does the remote administrator need? You need a computer certificate signed by an authority that the RRAS also trusts. And then you need remote access credentials. Okay, so what's going on here? IPSec is providing the machine, essentially the machine-to-machine authentication, right? But IPSec is missing a crucial component of VPN, is the ability to authenticate people. IPSec doesn't know anything about people. It's all about computers, right? So that's what L2TP is doing. It's authenticating the user and also providing a tunnel endpoint address. Make sure that the computer certificate is non-exportable, right? That was one of the things that we wanted to do, was limit the computers from which administration could occur. So when the administration workstation gets its machine certificate, can't export the private key from that. And then by having a user account requirement, right, we also know who the person is. So we both know where they're coming from and who they are. Again, no domain, so we had to have individual accounts on each machine for the users. We'll talk about passwords a little bit later. Yes, there is the token password slide in the presentation today. So you can only terminal service into the OpenHack terminal server. And then from there, you can terminal service to another machine, right, to the IIS box or to the SQL box or whatever. Now, yes, terminal server traffic is already encrypted, but we just didn't want to allow, that 3389 to sit out there open for people to just hammer against, right? Even though I don't think they would have successfully done anything. We're going to carry this up inside a VPN so that you have to authenticate yourself even before we bring the terminal server session up. Needed a couple file shares to satisfy conditions of the contest. The inbox share was set up to be write only, and this is where administrators would drop off new or modified content. Then we had an outbox share that was read only, where administrators could retrieve files for analysis or whatever. So there's a picture of the physical network. Sorry you guys don't have any of this in the book. Like I said, we just got the slides to Black Hat people yesterday. If you do want a copy of these slides, I'd be more than happy to provide you with that. come up and give me your business card, and then I'll just take the collection of cards and email the slides out a couple days from now. Then the last component, of course, is the database itself, right? This is what the attackers are really trying to go after. We spend so much time worrying about encrypting data in flight, but when was the last time you read a magazine article about somebody successfully stealing one Visa number in the internet? You never have, right? What do they do instead? They're going after the SQL servers that have 100,000 Visa numbers in them, right? That's where the interesting stuff is. But yet nobody talks about protecting data stores. They worry about encrypting their email. I don't know why. So it's all about reducing the surface area available to an attacker to try to break in over. So the number of things we do on SQL Server to reduce that surface area. Again, you know what? Service Pack 2, the latest the security patches. How many of you have ever tried to install a SQL Server security patch? It's awesome. Okay, these things deserve their own special hell. And I am so glad to see that we are now finally wrapping installer around these things. Right? I mean, it's just, it needed to be done. We're finally doing it. Now, you know what? Now you're going to be encouraged to go do it, right? Because it's just a click here, and it's not a xcopy DLL and hope you didn't typo. What are we omitting? A number of things we're omitting during the install. Right? We don't need them. This is dev stuff. You don't need these things in a production environment. We're disabling the distributed transaction coordinator. There are no transactions going on here. Okay? Most SQL Server installations don't need this thing, but people leave it on. Disabling the agent and search. A couple other things on the SQL Server. We are modifying the local security policy so that the only authentication request it receives is an NTLM-v2 challenge. That's it, nothing else. And then we configure SQL Server for Windows authentication only, right? That way, we talked about this before, we don't have to store these IDs and passwords in some file somewhere. Nevertheless, you do want to set a password on SA, right? In case the authentication method is accidentally changed. We set the audit level to failure so that we've got some forensic evidence if people are trying to, hack some login against this thing. But I guess maybe this is where I would have perhaps deviated a little bit from what we ultimately built. Let's say somebody does guess a password. How do you know if you don't log success, right? So my personal preference would have been to log success and failure. What about the SQL Server service account, right? SQL Server runs by default as what? Local system. It has too many privileges for our purpose here. So we create a local account that we run SQL Server under. Give it a strong password that the user can't change and specifically disallow terminal server access to this thing. You can use a domain user account here if the SQL Server service for some reason had to perform network activity. But for the purposes of our network, of our application here, the SQL Server service did not require network access, so we use a local account for that. Just a couple others that don't make sense to put on a slide by themselves. You want to take off all of the protocols except named pipes, okay? Except TCP IP, because we don't need named pipes for this case. And then this is more of a reliability thing, is that we go into the services control panel and tell SQL Server to restart if it failed for some reason. Question?
On the previous slide, the local service.
Yeah.
The local account for SQL Service.
Yeah.
Non-privileged, no privilege.
It's just a generic user account. Yeah.
Did you take away the right to interact with the desktop, the service can?
If you wanted to. We didn't do that, but sure.
I just wondered if you think that was reserved.
I wasn't the one that actually did the SQL, but we locked it down, in this case for OpenHack, within an inch of its life, literally. The application, as far as the database was concerned, was actually running nearly as a guest on the operating system. So I don't know whether I'd think about the interaction with desktop being important or not. Oh, but the main thing we were after was the minimum privilege. Guest was about as close as we got it. And
We're not saying we support running SQL Server as guest,
yeah,
but
it was done by someone who really knew his way around SQL.
Well, this was kind of like a race car security application. It was, you know, we did all sorts of stuff that wasn't necessarily supported just to see if it would work for 2 weeks, and didn't learn from that for 2 months.
That is a good recommendation, though, is to run SQL Server as the weakest domain account possible, so that rooting the SQL Server doesn't put the box at risk. And then in the mid-tier should have 0 OS privileges built in, nothing, so we just barely get access to SQL Server, and only those privileges on SQL Server that it needs. The configuration that you're used to seeing, or I'm used to seeing, is SQL Server installs local system, which means you lose the whole box and even the network, and the application running as SA, sometimes with a password. So.
right. Application permissions. So the first thing you should do is what? Delete all of the sample junk that gets installed, right? Because just remember, sample code is never written with security in mind, okay? Axiom. And then when we create the application database, there's a few things to remember. Grant the application account permissions on the stored procedures, right? But not on the database tables themselves. This way, the application can't just start executing ad hoc queries, right? All the application can do is talk to those stored procedures. And then you want to ensure that that application account, this is the IIS account, right? You want to ensure that that account has no permissions anywhere else inside SQL Server. So we're running out of time here. There's really not a whole lot of interesting things to look at. This is all just UI stuff. I want to hit the last couple slides and then leave some time for questions at the end. So do I need this slide up here, right, people? Okay. I mean, this is Black Hat, right? Not CSI. Sorry. So, you know, just basic stuff, right? You know, the super paranoid, don't forget the alt plus number pad, right? If you really want to forget your password a month from now. And go, what's that? No dictionary script? Okay, I'm not really that concerned. But, and go for length, right? Just go for length. So here's a funny thing. I had a customer I was doing a security review for, and they were migrating from NT4 to Windows 2000. And one of their policy things was passwords must be the maximum length supported by the operating system. For NT4, what was it? 14, right? Or 15. I mean, something you could manage, right? What is the maximum password length in Windows 2000? 256. Isn't it something like that? 128. 256. Okay, all right. So anyway, could you imagine typing a paragraph as your password? My dog and I went down to the corner store on Friday afternoon.
Fat finger.
Yeah. Of course, that's not as funny as you should go search on, there's a KV article that talks about a password sync problem with services for Unix and NFS or something like that, that an error will come up that says your password must be at least 32,745 characters and cannot be any different, or must be different than your previous 18,460 passwords. Somebody forgot to bounds check their UI, I think. So what did we learn from all of this? Well, every deployment is unique, right? A lot of what you've seen here today was specific for OpenHack. But, you know, there's certain principles that apply everywhere. One, you don't need a firewall. Yay! So use, adapt, modify this stuff as necessary, right? You know, there's a ton of information out there about this. If you just go Google on OpenHack, you're going to get more than you'll ever want to know. But after all, this is a PowerPoint presentation, right? So I do need to state the obvious, which I even have to back up and read because I still don't have it memorized, right? Plan for security in the original design. I went on a customer, did something for a customer one time where they had been working on something for 2 years, and a week before rollout, they said, oh, hell, we better put security in this thing. Okay? I wasn't too helpful to them because every half hour I was saying, oh, wait a minute, but you got to change the design, right? And they didn't want to hear that. Install the latest service packs and patches, you know, and so your design should include a plan for how you do that. Use complex, non-intuitive passwords. Reduce the service area by disabling unnecessary functionality. Adhere to this principle of least privilege. You know how we're talking about these accounts here that can't do much of anything, right? Anticipate failure. Practice defense in depth. You're saying, but you don't have any defense in depth because you don't have any firewalls, right? Are you thinking that? We don't need them. We got a ton of depth here. Did medieval castles have 2 firewalls and nothing else protecting them? How come our networks are built with 2 firewalls and nothing else protecting them? You got your outer firewall and your inner firewall, right? 2 firewalls, 2 moats. Medieval castles didn't have 2 moats. They had 1. But then what? Big, heavy doors. Dark, twisty passageways. Monstrous guys, way bigger than I am, with sharp metal swords. Boiling oil, right? I mean, there are lots of layers there you can get. You don't need to rely on the network for all of them. What's that? Yeah, I like the boiling oil too. So how do we, anybody want to write a boiling oil protocol? I think that would be a really good idea. Always, always, always run JISLockDown and URLScan on every web server you build from now until you die. You don't need to worry about it after you die because you don't care anymore. But you do that. This just becomes a standard practice for you now. Validate all input data and use only stored parameters or stored procedures that are, what am I saying, parameterized, right, when you talk to the database. Any questions? Yeah?
If you have a DMZ, a lot of e-commerce sites that need to have a single sign-on for them.
Okay, so they're living in fantasy land because we have an e-commerce site that wants single sign-on.
Right.
Okay.
You know, many different sites rather than like a standalone, one standalone
Right.
application. How would you modify this? Or would you just tear it up and start in a different direction? Because obviously, in this case, you're using your SQL server as your directory information store. You know,
Right.
things like backup for the directory and so forth. You're getting to a lot more involvement there. But, you know, what direction would you go by that type of simple sign?
So the question is, let's say that we have multiple instances of this thing, but we want to have one user directory that all of the instances can share. Kind of what you're saying, right? Well, you could certainly have, you could break out your application database from your user database, right? Here we're using one single SQL Server box with a user database and an application database, right? So you could break these things out, and you could have a SQL Server box that does nothing but hold the common user directory and use many of these same principles. Now, if the different instances of this were separated by firewalls, you know, you'll need to somehow ensure that we are communicating between each instance in the common user store in a secure manner, right? So maybe IPSec and open the firewall for IPSec just between these individual hosts. So, you know, I'm just kind of imagining things here as I'm talking to you.
Well, because, you know, it is not just a common however, you know, in a large organization, you've got individuals wanting single, you know, they don't want to remember 20 different user IDs and passwords. Okay? So, how to bring those sites together and
Right.
those applications and even your internal network, you know, with Active Directory, it would seem that would be the ideal to try to go towards an Active Directory. But
Oh, yeah.
opening up your service area quite a bit, putting an Active Directory component out into public internet.
Well, you know, that's an interesting thing that a number of people seem to believe, that as soon as you put a box that is a domain controller in a DMZ, that, you know, life as we know it is going to come to a screeching halt. I don't believe that's true. I have customers who have deployed Active Directory in a DMZ, right? And mostly it's a separate forest that we have a one-way trust, right, back into the corp forest so that corp administrators can administer the DMZ for us without having to have an ID there. And they're totally happy with it and haven't had any kind of directory-related compromise. Okay? Others, I have one customer who has extended his corp forest into his DMZ. He is effectively now operating DMZ-less. Because he's decided that the traditional DMZ design is now unable to satisfy his business needs. So he's got a single flat corporate network, some services of which are available to people on the outside, and they love it, right? We've got people who are doing it now. It just depends on what comfort level are you at and when you do something like this. Now, I do want to say that Passport is a possible solution to this here, right? But the thing you got to remember with Passport is anybody can go to passport.com and register a passport under anybody's name. So if identity is critical to you, you need to have some process by which you're verifying identity before a user can get a passport. Is this useful to your answer to your question?
What will you do with an OpenHack using Active Directory?
Probably a year from now, OpenHack 5.
We wanted to actually do it this year, but we were disallowed from doing it as part of the contest. So that's why we wound up with standalone servers, but that's exactly what we were planning on doing for OpenHack was an Active Directory solution.
Who disallowed that?
eWeek.
eWeek.
Is it going to be Active Directory, or is it going to be Active Directory with application management added?
So is it
I
if,
didn't-
say we do it for OpenHack 5, are we going to use regular AD or are we going to use Atom?
I'd have to see what we were doing with it. We would probably be pushing.
We'd probably go for regular
We're pushing
AD.
for as
right?
much technology that's up to speed. We wanted to do it with .NET/2003. Again, they asked that we use just product that was available on the shelf to regular consumers. So basically, if the technology is going to be available, we're going to leverage as much of it as we can to show it off.
Do you see anybody that's actually doing anything with like open validation? So obviously, we input all the, the parameters and validate that we're receiving what we should be before we pass it on to our database. But are we also at the application layer verifying that the data that's being presented back to the client is actually supposed to be, like ODBC errors is an obvious thing, then we wouldn't want to present that back to the client, or the whole user underscore whatever.
Right. And this is a really good question. He's asking about, are we doing output validation, right? So we're validating all this stuff that's coming in, but information that we present to the client, are we validating that output? In a minimal way, well, it's not validation, okay? We're doing that HTML in code. So we're just sending static text down to the client. But if there were, have you all gone to some website somewhere that's been database driven, you try to enter something and the database is crapped out and you get a database error that has all kinds of useful forensic information in it, or I should say reconnaissance information in it? We didn't design anything like that into OpenHack, but that's an excellent point. And it's probably something you want to account for, right? So if you're seeing SQL errors or ODBC errors coming back from the database to the web app, don't send that stuff on to the client. We didn't do anything like that here.
The flip side of that being that we.
For extensions that we're not allowing, but that's it.
Right. And in order to get an ODBC error back, something would have to have broken with the stored procedures. So, and to my knowledge, we never had an instance of that occurring. But again, that would be another depth to guarantee that the stored procedures were set up correctly, and if they weren't, going back to the client would be, with output validation, would be yet another layer we could add.
Another question?
Yeah, you talked about some other tweaks you did on the web server box. Did you do anything else in the SQL server?
What you saw here was it.
Steve, is this documented, written up someplace so that we can go and download it?
Yeah. Here you go. Write this down. I'm giving you the URL right now. Here's the paper from which I built the slides over the last day and a half. msdn.microsoft.com/library/ oh, hell, it got cut off. Okay, so go to MSDN and search on the following. OpenHack. Okay? It's really easy to find.
Actually comes up as the first search result on MSDN, or if you just go to Microsoft.com
I didn't write it, man. Okay.
But it's the first one on Microsoft.com.
Cool. Thank you. Is that it? All right, thanks very much. Great talking to you. And I hope to